I'm Anne, co-host of Transparency in Teaching, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey, welcome back. Steve here, and today I'm talking with Gary Santos. Gary is the son of Eugene Santos, who at the age of 17 served on the USS Randolph in the Pacific Theater of World War II. Gary is also the author of the historical fiction novel A Grand Pause, a novel on May 14, 1945, the USS Randolph, Kamikazes, and the Greatest Air-Sea Rescue. His story is based upon true events surrounding the USS Randolph, his father, and an amazing air-sea rescue. Awesome story, page-turner, brings the era back to life. It's so cool. Thanks so much for listening. And oh, by the way, before you go, there's so many different ways you could help the podcast out, and here are three. For example, one, you could tell a friend, share the links with them. Say, hey, you ought to listen to Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12. Another way is to go to my website and leave a review and subscribe. And here's another one. Click on the link on my website homepage to buy me a coffee. When you do this, it takes you to a page where you can donate $1 or $2 to help me address the costs associated with producing the podcast. All of that would be so cool. Thanks so much for thinking about it. Thanks so much for maybe doing that, huh? What do you think? You're awesome. Enjoy the show.
So the Randolph was one of 24 Essex-class aircraft carriers, one of the great class of vessels for their service during World War II and for the post-war, the Cold War service. These ships contributed mightily to our Navy and our national defense. Randolph was a ship that almost seemed to be blessed. It was a fortunate vessel, but it also lurked in the background and it never grabbed the headlines. It in many ways was a mystery ship.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Milletto. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. With Dr. Steve Milletto.
Gary Santos has worked in aviation for over 35 years as an aircraft mechanic. He attended City College and College of Aeronautics. A lifelong New Yorker, he currently resides on the South Shore of Long Island. He has extensively studied the history of the ship his father, Eugene Santos, was stationed on during World War II, the USS Randolph, and he also collects World War II memorabilia. He resides on the South Shore of Long Island, New York. Our focus is Gary's book, A Grand Pause, a novel on May 14, 1945, the USS Randolph, Kamikazes, and the Greatest Air-Sea Rescue. Gary, thanks so much for being on the show, and say hi to everyone.
Hello, Steve. Thank you for having me, and hello, everybody.
Well, glad to have you here, Gary, and let's start by talking about your father. Who was he? Where did he call home, and what did he do before the war, and how old was he when he got into the war?
So Dad grew up in Depression-era New York City. His name is Eugene Santos. It was a difficult time in our history, the Depression. And of course, it affected the Santos family. He was basically a high school dropout, no direction in life. And the 2 years he served in the Navy, he credited with giving him direction, a purpose in life. And surviving the World War definitely, gave him what he felt was a second chance.
That's awesome. So when he entered the war, he's like 18?
No. So he enlisted when he was 17. Again, partly because he had no direction in life and as a dropout. And he also did not want to join the Marines or get drafted by the Marines or Army. So he chose to enlist in the Navy.
Gotcha. So I want to point that out, which I appreciate you talking about that, because I think that plays a big role in what we learn about the USS Randolph and such in just a little bit. So now you've had a 30-year career in aviation. Could you share a little about this and how your profession may have helped you in writing your book?
So most of my writing over the past 3 decades have been technical in nature. And technical writing is you describe objects and process. It's used largely for problem solving. And unbeknownst to me, it was improving my writing style. In the, for example, in the book, when I'm creating the dive bombing scene, dive bombers are starting their dives at 10,000 feet. Well, how do I make this relatable to the reader? And the tech writer in me says that, 1,000 feet is about the height of the Empire State Building. So 10,000 feet will be 10 Empire State Buildings. So I create a scene where the dive bombers are swooping down from the height of 10 Empire State Buildings, just to make that relatable to the reader. If it adds drama, then it becomes parsley on top of the meat and potatoes.
Yeah, I like that. That's you start understanding that that's a long ways up there when they start.
Oh yeah. Right.
Oh my gosh, you're falling down towards the earth on purpose. So awesome. So all right. So let's shift back a little bit, because I want to make sure that we share that you have some personal understanding of how things work from the sky. And so your dad served on the USS Randolph during World War II. Could you tell us a little bit about the ship?
So the Randolph was one of 24 Essex-class aircraft carriers, one of the great class of vessels. For their service during World War II and for the post-war, the Cold War service, these ships contributed mightily to our Navy and our national defense. Randolph was a ship that almost seemed to be blessed. It was a fortunate vessel, but it also lurked in the background. It never grabbed the headlines. It in many ways was a mystery ship. At the time of commissioning, the ship's master, Captain Felix Baker, challenged the crew to deliver Randolph at the fastest possible time to the fighting Pacific. The crew rose to the challenge immediately. The gunnery and stores department, and my father being in the stores department, filled the ship's magazines in a record time, I believe 3 days, shaving several days off the record. The ship, when it went out on sea trials, never returned back to port for adjustment repairs, which was the first time that a complex capital ship just sailed directly to combat. The turnaround time for Randolph from commissioning to combat was 4 months. A record that was never duplicated by any ship. Randolph was struck by a kamikaze in the Pacific while she was at port. One of the rare time, if only time, that a U.S. warship was struck by a kamikaze in a friendly port. Literally, the aft end of the ship was destroyed, and most of the Navy hierarchy thought that the Randolph would require several months in a U.S. dry dock for repair. But once again, the ship's captain, Felix Baker, ordered the repairs done at this port at Ulithi Atoll. So Randolph was literally rebuilt in 19 days in a lagoon without any kind of shipyard facilities, overhead gantries, cranes, nothing like that. Just by sheer brute manpower, welders, a lot of learn as you go to bang the ship back together. And 19 days, Randolph sailed back out to combat. So it's a ship that has an incredible history, not only World War II, but after World War II as well.
That's awesome. And I've got to say this before I go any further, because one of the things that happens to you is that you've become a collector of memorabilia, and you're studying the history of World War II, and I just have to think that one of the things that impacts this interest for you is that your dad did talk to you about his time on the USS Randolph. Could you talk about some of what what he shared with you about what happened there?
Yeah, so this ship uh, was probably the second most important thing in my father's life after family. As I mentioned earlier, the experience on this ship and in the Navy gave him direction, a sense of purpose in life. This ship was also a way that he uh, brought up my brother and myself. The ship became a metaphor. If we had challenges in our life, fears and trepidations, school, he would always bring up a Randolph metaphor. And so this ship was very instrumental in my upbringing, as well as my brother's upbringing.
Very cool. And it's awesome that he shared this time and so forth with you, and talked about it in such a way. What do you know? One of the things that I know you've studied is the impact that these aircraft carriers had on warfare and naval warfare especially. But could you talk just a little bit about that before we move on?
Sure.
Which is that
Sure.
they changed warfare.
Oh, absolutely. And so from the time of the Spanish Armada, that would be about 1588, naval battles were fought in a line, two opposing fleets slugging it out amongst each other. And nothing changed for centuries. As the girth of the guns increased, so did the ranges. But the the combat at sea was fought in a battle line between battleships. And most of the American strategy and doctrine at the time went to this battle line. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was the first time a Navy attacked over the horizon. And, in one fell swoop, to quote Shakespeare, the U.S. battle fleet was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. And the Americans that had used aircraft carriers as a subcomponent of the battle fleet, the aircraft carrier was basically the eyes for the battle fleet. It would hunt down the enemy fleet and direct the battleships over there. The U.S. Navy now had to use the aircraft carrier as the primary weapon. So with this in mind, they had to develop new tactics as they went along, with attacking targets over the horizon. The aircraft carrier was also extremely vulnerable because they had wood flight decks, a lot of ordnance and gasoline below decks. So there was a fear in this, in the Navy hierarchy that that U.S. carriers should be used in a hit and run type of offensive. It winds up, at the start of the war, these carriers are being moved on a chessboard by battleship admirals. It takes a man who's familiar with aviation, whose career had been stagnated because he was promoting aviation. People like Mark Michener, what he's given command of the aircraft carriers, he rewrites naval warfare. All of a sudden, any point on the Pacific can come under a sustained attack, and lumping the aircraft carriers together not only intensifies the attack, but it also it creates a level of protection for the fleet as well. And once Mark Michener got his fast carrier task force, scouring the Pacific, the Japanese lines just kept moving further and further towards their home island.
It's amazing that just the ability to put the planes on there, to take off, to collect them up. Basically, they're floating cities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I had a chance when I was a Boy Scout leader, I had a chance we would take our troop to spend the night on, and I believe it was the USS Yorktown. It was in
South Carolina.
Yes.
Yes, so that would be the Yorktown.
Yes, it was interesting because being on there, because the scouts would stay in the bunks the way they had them set up there, and you could see the kitchens and all kinds of stuff, and there was movies and things about how they fed them, but just simply being on the ship, itself, you feel in some cases how large they are, and also some cases how compartmentalized their world would have been, and just a fascinating. It's just amazing.
Right.
What they were able to
And
do.
when you're there with the scout troop, you're talking about 20, 30, 40 people. The Essex class carriers normally had a ship's complement of 3,000.
That's
So
amazing.
the ship was huge, but there definitely were tight quarters. My father's bunk, there was probably 100 sailors sleeping in his quarters.
Wow. Yeah, that's just amazing. What they were able to orchestrate, especially, when you think about the attack on Pearl Harbor, destroying the fleet, and then they have to put things back together again and then go on the offensive. Just amazing what has to happen. So, one of the things that I wanted to, I could talk about all kinds of stuff around this for a while with you. But, our focus today is your book. Your book is called A Grand Pause, a novel on May 14th, 1945, the USS Randolph, Kamikazes, and the Greatest Air-Sea Rescue. What does the title A Grand Pause refer to?
Yes. So I had several working titles of the book until I settled on this one. A grand pause is a musical expression. In an orchestra, when music stops abruptly for dramatic purposes and starts up again, it's known as a grand pause. So in this story, there is a minor subplot of 25 musicians from the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra that are aboard the ship, and they don't want to be there. And this is a true story. They enlisted in the Navy to entertain troops in the Philadelphia Naval Yard, which they did for a couple of years. Then the Navy changed their minds, grew tired of musicians, and installed them on the commissioning crew of the Randolph. So in a hypothetical conversation, I had one of the violinists mention that his service on board the ship was a grand pause. So that becomes a metaphor for the greater story. That the 3,000-man crew of USS Randolph is basically pausing the war to rescue two of their own from Japanese territory.
It's awesome knowing what you're referring to, and then knowing that this is what happened. I mean, it's literally like everything comes to a little bit of a standstill while these other events take place.
Mm-hmm.
And but I have to say, what a interesting thing to happen though, that they enlisted so they could perform at a naval yard and then end up in the middle of the war.
Exactly. And then they weren't prepared. They were given uniforms and told to salute officers. That was the extent of their training.
Wow.
And after a couple of years, they got thrown on board a ship which they were never trained for. So they were basically used as orderlies to run messages back and forth. But they did, the captain did allow them to perform concerts in the deck, and the steel hangar deck of an aircraft carrier provides excellent acoustics. So the crew was literally treated to quality music of Carnegie Hall.
That's wild. I think before I go on to what I wanted to ask next, I think here would be a good point, a part to kind of make the fleet as it was operating in, I believe, Okinawa area. Didn't it have a unique name because of the ages of the people that were on the ships and such?
Well, the area the ship was operating on was known as Kamikaze Alley. So the fleet was being attacked from three different directions. It was being attacked from Okinawa, from Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and from Japan itself. So these attacks came from three different directions every day, and the map makers referred to the area as Kamikaze Alley.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about before we take another step into your book. Let's talk a little bit more about the historical, that air sea rescue. How did you really kind of find out about it?
I was after my father passed away in 2017. I started researching the ship, just not with any goal in mind, but just as a way to honor my father, to keep his memory alive. I was making several trips a year to the National Archives at not the one in Washington, D.C., the one in the University of Maryland that has the U.S. Navy World War II records. And I would peruse the ship's logs and after action reports. And I stumbled onto this incredible rescue just by chance, dumb luck. And most of the action reports are very dry reading. Time, dates, units involved. You normally don't read it line to line. You just skim through the paragraphs. But the action reports relating to this rescue, the pilots had a lot of fun with it. They almost like they understood the sense of history that was involved. I'm reading this action report. There's several action reports, and I'm reading them, and I feel like I'm almost reading James Michener's The Bridges at Tokori. And I'm dumbfounded that this was never a book. This was never a movie. I wondered whether it's my own personal bias with the ship that made me believe that this was a great rescue. At New York Public Library, I was able to research some of the newspapers articles of the day, and this rescue actually made headlines, not headlines, but front page stories in the nation's newspapers. Admiral Michener, the task force commander, referred to it as one of the greatest rescues that the U.S. Navy had ever undertaken. So at this point, I'm pretty much sure that this is not my personal bias, that this is a great rescue, and this story needed to be told.
That's awesome. That's and it is. I can only imagine how dry some of those reports were, because
I've spent hours in the National Archives where I was ready to pluck out my eyeballs. But I tell you, the pilots really had fun with this action report.
That's fascinating. So can you share a little bit about what actually historically happened that sends them on this rescue mission?
Yeah. So if you just indulge me a couple of minutes to build up to the rescue.
Sure.
The Battle of Okinawa was the last of the island offensives. It was meant to be captured and used as a staging area for the eventual invasion of Japan. It's thought of as, we remember it as one of those bloody island offensive, which it was. but it was also the bloodiest and longest naval battle in history. For 3 months, the U.S. Navy was under constant kamikaze attacks. There were more sailors dying at sea than Marines and soldiers ashore. The 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 Navy could never get the Air Force to bomb kamikaze bases. Yeah, the Air Force and Navy had competing interests, competing strategies, and the Air Force had a strategic bombing campaign that they were committed to. So on this day, May 14th, 1945, the fast carrier task force separates from the Fifth Fleet off of Okinawa and arrives offshore of the southernmost Japanese island, Kyushu, where these kamikazes are flown all over Japan into this island. Japan is an island nation. Several islands uh, make up the empire, and three of those islands ring the Seto Inland Sea, a sheltered sea. And Randolph, in the course of these attacks, loses one bomber, a two-man bomber, a pilot and a gunner, and they're forced to ditch into this sheltered sea, surrounded by Japanese. They make it onto a life raft, and the Japanese attempt to capture them. The the CAG, the commander of the air group, keeps fighters overhead to protect their brethren, and it becomes it becomes this crucible to to rescue these two men, because it's who we are, right? It you know the this is what distinguishes us Americans from our adversaries. Our value of life. That we're willing to sacrifice our own lives to rescue these two stranded sailors surrounded by enemy, where the enemy would not conduct such an effort to in time, manpower, to save only two. But again, it's who we are.
It's one of the things that becomes obvious as you're talking about this day and all the stuff that's going on, and because we're literally fighting two distinct parts of the world. As Europe is.
What makes this well, in May 14th, 1945, Germany had already surrendered about a week earlier. But the war with Japan, there was no end in sight. And Japan should have surrendered after they lost their fifth carrier battle, because the front door to Japan had been kicked open. But they had this, they fought to the death. And in the island of Luzon in the Philippines, they had about 250,000 defenders when the army first landed in the Philippines. Literally every one of them had to be killed because they did not surrender. And they brought this mentality throughout the entire campaign. They fought to the death. And by May 14th, I believe it was the 54th day of the Okinawa campaign, and the U.S. Navy already had 100 ships struck by kamikazes at that point. And it was just, again, it's known as a bloody island offensive, but it was also the bloodiest naval battle in history.
It's just amazing, because I think one of the things that it really brings to mind, which is the idea of what you're talking about, which is how do you fight against somebody who would rather give up their life than see that it's a no-win situation. And how did we? I mean, did we change what we were doing to try and deal with this, or?
Well, actually, both sides. Both sides were. It was a thrust and parry. Uh, both sides were adjusting to the other. The Americans had technology at their disposal where the Japanese didn't. But even the best way to defeat the kamikaze attacks was picking them on radar and intercepting them with our own planes at the furthest possible distance. Well, the early radar was designed to detect formations and not single airplanes, and that's the Japanese, learned that they can have individual attacks from all points of the compass, and they may or may not be picked up by the American radar. They knew that flying low was an area where they can sneak in on the fleet. And now the fleet has to adjust to these things. So the fleet has low flying fighters on the perimeters, just searching for the Japanese. The you know back in the electronics laboratory, they're trying to develop a tighter looking radar that can pick up individual airplanes. So yeah, it was a thrust and parry. The Japanese were absolutely slaughtered attacking the fleet. I mean, several thousand planes were destroyed on in at the periphery without ever actually seeing an American ship. But all you need is one or two airplanes to penetrate the radar and attack the fleet, and you have several hundred dead.
Yeah, I can only imagine, especially when you have from the ammunition to, I mean, because with all those people on board those ships, then to have something come slamming into it that then ignites the fuel and the
Right.
the
So that was the
ammunition.
case with the USS Bunker Hill, which was also an Essex class carrier, and it was Admiral Michener's flagship. On 3 days before my story takes place, the Bunker Hill is struck by two kamikaze, and she has an armed, fully fueled strike group in the hangar about ready to be brought up to the flight deck, and it just one explosion after another as the ammunition and fuel ignites. Admiral Michener is almost killed. He had several members of his staff killed. The United States Navy lost about 6,000 sailors in the Battle of Okinawa, uh, twice the number as the attack on Pearl Harbor. And what's amazing about it is most times in combat, your wounded outnumber your death, the number of death. But in Okinawa, the Navy suffered more deaths than wounded. It just shows you the lethality of the kamikaze when it comes exploding into a ship. Your chances were greater of dying than being wounded.
Just amazing because it's first of all, war is not it's not something to be taken lightly, and then to know the numbers that would perish because of sometimes single actions that take place that as a plane gets through the defenses or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Just amazing. One of the things that I think your book does a great job of is you get the feeling of it highlighting honor and duty and this toll on humans. Can you just kind of talk to that just a little bit?
Yeah. So I think the way we honor this generation and any generation that went to war is to remember that they they're scared stiff. Hollywood tends to have these unrealistic portrayals of soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen that are totally fearless. They run cheerfully go running into combat. That is not true. I mean, someone once said that there are no atheists in combat because everybody is terrified. My father often said that the only person that's not scared in war is a dead person. Everybody's terrified. So with that in mind, I mean, I try to honor these people as warriors that are terrified, but they're overcoming their fears and accomplishing the task at hand.
One of the things I constantly have to go back to is because like your father is 17 when he
Yes.
ends up on the ship, and those ships were probably filled with a lot of 17 and 18-year-olds. Wouldn't you think?
Oh my God, yes. So a lot of teenagers. Uh, the Navy grew so fast uh, that Randolph and most of the other carriers, about 85% of the crew had never been out to sea before.
Wow.
And so they're like in every war, it's fought by teenagers. They're literally going from their teenage years and they're leaping into their 40s. They're skipping the whole adolescence. And back in World War II, there was no type of program on how to adjust to this. It basically, the individual had to learn it itself. Now in our time, there's more efforts in post-traumatic stress and dealing with losses and that there was ever in the past. So yes, so these sailors, and I write about my father, not that he did anything substantial in the war. He'd be the first one to say he was just a little cog, but he represents the lowliest sailor that had his life disrupted, from whether it's a farmland or streets of New York City, and gets put into this greatest naval battle in history, and overcoming the odds and surviving.
Just amazing. So let's shift back to your book for a minute. So you had to you created characters and believable dialogue. How'd you do that? I mean, because, there's so much that's, like you said about those reports, that is not lively, but yet you're going to create interactions with characters that are very believable, and you're going to create dialogue and such. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I almost feel it's a two-part question, because most of the characters are true. I did not create the characters, and in the case of Admiral Mitchner, there was there's documented books and reports and biographies about him. And the pilot who led the rescue, he wrote his memoirs, Hamilton McWhorter. So and I was able to go to Ancestry and hook up with a lot of the family members. The character that I did create, I created two Japanese pilots on their last day of life. And that was very challenging because it was literally painful to try to get into the mind of a Japanese kamikaze pilot. We tend to simplify their motives just to explain it. Oh, the Japanese wanted to die. This is not true. The Japanese wanted to live. They had this ancient Bushido code that prioritized death before dishonor. Going back to the age of antiquities, they fought to the death to capture castles, and one generation after another passes this to the next. This Bushido code, death before dishonor. And if you survive a defeat, you're almost obligated to kill yourself because you've embarrassed Japan, you've embarrassed your family name. So trying to put this on paper, that was the challenge. But once again, I was able to get some uh, interrogation of Japanese kamikaze pilots that never flew after the war, and I tried to use those their dialogue and the dialogue of these two Japanese pilots that I created on their last day. One being, uh, you know, a teenage pilot that had aspirations of being, uh, a great warrior of the sky, a samurai of the sky, but instead, his mission is to crash an airplane into a ship. And the other is a Japanese commander who was once a great fighter pilot that was injured in battle, and now his job was to train uh, the Japanese youth to die, and he's revolted by it, and he chooses to end his life by flying one of these missions.
You know, I it's just cannot even imagine what it would just, because if you did not do it, if you did not follow through, you would be humiliating your family.
Right. And in Japanese society, honor is very important. The Japanese during World War II were probably the most complex people in the history of the human race. And I feel I was only able to tap on that. I mean, you can write entire books on the Japanese psychology of World War II. I was only able to touch upon it.
Gotcha. One of the things that I want to point out is that, a grand pause is historical fiction. I mean, could you talk about how historical fiction can help keep memories alive of real events of the past and, the kind of role that it plays?
Sure, from my selfish point of view, it allowed me to make my father live once again. In his pages, in the pages of the book, he was alive once again. And some of the family members told me that, again, I did it for a selfish point of view, but a lot of the family members told me the same thing, that they had knots in their stomach when their beloved father or grandfather was mentioned in the book. So that's the power of historical fiction.
It's awesome. It gives them a chance to be alive in people's minds again. And
Right. So this was the generation that stormed Normandy, planted the flag on Mount Suribachi, and to see them once again, you know, World War II was probably the last war that was you can define as good versus evil. All the wars that followed were, murky. The motives, the consequences, the the politics. But as this World War II generation is dying off, and very shortly they're all going to be gone. We're becoming nostalgic on what dad, grandpa, uncle did, and so historical fiction is a good avenue to see how these group of people and not just men but women also. Women played a large part in World War II that has gone you know unnoticed for decades.
you know, I we're getting close to finishing up, Gary,
Mhm.
and one more writing question here. Did you ever look at a blank page and not know what to write?
So this story wrote itself again from the action reports. The story wrote itself. The you know the the obstacles was again telling the story from the Japanese perspective. Yeah, and I spend several hours, days, just hitting a brick wall, trying to describe the Japanese on paper.
So when you hit those brick walls, did you have anything to solve it? Did you have anything that you'd like get up and go do something or?
Yeah, I don't know if there was any tricks. Just just going back to history. History tells a story, and and when you stumble onto a passage, then all of a sudden it becomes easier to write.
Excellent. Gary, I mean, this is fascinating. I enjoyed reading your book and learning and so much about a situation I had no knowledge of, and as well as to your recreation of the events and the characters and such through your work of fiction, which is awesome. If someone wanted to learn more, get a copy of your book, or reach out to you, where would you send them?
So the book can be purchased online on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I maintain a Facebook page, facebook.com/a one word. And I also maintain a website for the ship's history, USS Randolph, CV15.com. And I love hearing from people, especially the family members or anybody that served on the ship. They're just a delight to talk to or email, converse with.
Excellent. I'll put that information in the show notes so it's easy for people to find to reach out to you. Gary, I can't thank you enough. I got one last question. Is a question that I like to ask my guests, and it goes like this: Did you ever have a teacher in your past who made a difference in your life? If so, who was it, and what would you say if given a chance to say thank you?
Yeah, so I think all through my formative years, there was always a good teacher, a teacher that set me in the proper way. But if I was to pick one, he's not even a teacher himself, but he acts like a teacher. That would be a co-worker when I started working in aircraft maintenance, and he was already in his 50s. I was in my early 20s, and he was almost like a mentor. He doesn't have a degree, but he has enough college credits to probably get 12 masters. He's literally an expert in every field, but he's down to earth. He never, he never talks down to anybody. And when I finished the draft of this book, and I needed somebody to read it, I came to him, and there were some paragraphs that didn't work. And again, the teacher inside him, he wouldn't tell me how to correct it. He would pull the answers out of my mind. In his own book, he has his forward. In his forward, he dedicates to teachers and their value. And his name is Carl Hasper. He's in his 80s, and he's still the smartest person I know. His body's breaking down, but he's still the smartest person I know.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Gary, thank you so much for taking us through and sharing your book, A Grand Pause, a novel on May 14th, 1945, the USS Randolph, Kamikazes, and the Greatest Air-Sea Rescue. What an awesome story about a real event. And thank you for keeping the USS Randolph and the Air-Sea Rescue alive. Wishing you the best in all you do.
Thank you. And you and your listeners have a good day.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.